In this video, we'll introduce the higher centers of the brain. Now let's start with the architecture. That when we look at the brain, we see that there's these ridges and folds. Now let's first start talking about what is the overall function of the cerebrum. And we could just keep it to the bare minimum right now and say it is about higher mental functions. And of course, that is a very quick description. We'll see that there's a lot that happens there. Now, let's look at these ridges and these folds, and we're going to give them a name in that the sulci are the shallow grooves on the surface of the cerebrum, and gyri are the elevated ridges that are found between the sulci. Now, sulcus, gyrus, those are the singular version of it. And we can see that this occurs right at the very surface here. Now, think about it. Whenever we see folding within structures, one of the reasons it occurs is because it's about increasing surface area, because we have a very limited volume in our cranial cavity, and this allows us to maximize it by having a folded structure to the outer surface of the brain. And remember, that outer surface, when we're looking at the brain, is gray matter. Gray matter is on the outside and white matter is on the inside. Now, there's some other anatomical terms that we should look at. Fissures. Fissures are deep grooves on the surface of the cerebellum, and there's some that have specific names, like the longitudinal fissure. And this separates the left and right cerebral hemispheres. We also have cavities deep within each cerebral hemisphere, such as the right hemisphere surrounds the right lateral ventricle, and the left hemisphere surrounds the left lateral ventricle. Now, this will make more sense once you start to look at diagrams of the brain. Now, the one plug I should put in is, before we go too far and start looking at the brain and working our way down into the midbrain and to the brain stem, do make sure that you have watched a few times the two videos that are on the three-dimensional architecture or design of the brain. They are on our class website. It's a walkthrough looking at 3D models, and it's really important that you get a handle as to which part of the brain is where and their relationships. So I would suggest, if you haven't done that yet, maybe you want to stop the video here and go get that done, and then come on back. Okay, let's carry on. So when we start looking at the brain, the surface, we can see that we have the left basically hemisphere, the right hemisphere. Here's a longitudinal fissure. Here is, you notice that there's one of these sulci, the sulcus, right here and right here, and it kind of stands out from the rest because this one really goes from the top along the side of the brain and sort of wraps underneath, and it's very distinctive once you look at it. And that's the central sulcus. This is going to be an important landmark, because this is the central sulcus, and in front of it is something called the precentral gyrus. And not surprisingly, behind it is the post-central gyrus. And those become important names as we go through some of our discussions. And of course, the brain can be broken down into lobes. We have the area of the frontal lobe, we have the area of the parietal lobe, we have occipital lobe, and we can't quite see it that well from this view, but we have temporal lobe, and we'll look at some of that architecture as we go. So the 5 lobes that we have are, as I said, are the frontal, the parietal, the temporal, the occipital, and there's one called the insula. And it's an interesting one because it's hidden from view. You have to sort of reflect, which means to move out of the way part of the brain to actually see it, because it lies a little bit deep to one part of the brain. So let's have a look, and here we can see that here is that central sulcus, and you can see it's really distinctive because it's sort of bigger, deeper, and runs from top to bottom. And the central sulcus divides the frontal lobe from, there's the central sulcus again, the parietal lobe. We also have the occipital lobe, and the occipital lobe is this region, and we have the temporal lobe right here, and you can see it outlined by those dash marks. So that's frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, temporal lobe. Now where's the next one? And that would be the insula, and we'll see that in a moment. Now, here we can see it on a real brain. You can see that central sulcus runs through here, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, temporal lobe, occipital lobe. Now this is the lateral fissure. You see there's a lateral fissure there. And if you don't remember what the term fissure means, go back, have a look. Now, the central sulcus, as we mentioned before, in front is a gyrus, and right in front of it. And because it's just in front of the central sulcus, we're going to call it the precentral gyrus. And there's the central sulcus again. There is a gyrus right behind it, which we're going to call the postcentral gyrus. So let's have a look, work our way through some of these lobes. Well, the frontal lobe is the most anterior. Its posterior border is the central sulcus, and it sits just behind the precentral gyrus. Okay. The neurons, what happens here? The neurons are responsible for planning and executing movement. Also has a role in behavior, consciousness, personality. So very complex mental functions. And a lot of integration of information occurs here. The parietal lobe, just posterior to the frontal lobes, contain the postcentral gyrus, which is just posterior to the central sulcus. And here the neurons are involved in processing and integrating sensory information, and also have a function in terms of attention. Now we're going to see that often different parts of the brain are involved in very similar type of activities, and often they support each other. The temporal lobe, lateral surfaces, and it's separated from the parietal and the frontal lobe by the lateral fissure, which we had a look at just moments ago. Its role falls into the categories of hearing, language, memory, and emotion. The occipital lobe is at the posterior aspect of the cerebral hemisphere, and it is separated from the parietal lobe by the parieto-occipital sulcus. And really, this is related to vision. And the insulas, there's one on each side, they're deep underneath the lateral fissures. And there are still parts of the brain where we're really trying to work out their exact relationship to other parts of the brain, what processing they do, etc. But they really seem to have a role when it comes to taste and viscera, the internal organs. Now, where's the insula? We haven't seen it yet. And what you have to do is actually reflect back, which means move out of the way. So we had the temporal lobe that was here, and what we've done is we've just pulled the margin of the temporal lobe down. And when you do, you can actually see the insula is buried within there. Okay, so that was just a quick rundown of the basic architecture and the organization of the brain. We're going to come back and start to look at it in more details in the next video.